Order, order. All right, I'd like to get started. Clink, clink, clink.
Hey, Margot.
All right, let's get this started. This is a good crowd. Welcome, everyone. I am Ken Coleman. I'm the Director of the Center for Political Studies here at ISR. It is a great pleasure on behalf of all the faculty and staff in CPS to welcome you today. This is our Miller-Converse lecture. Our speaker today has generated quite a bit of buzz on campus already. He's given multiple talks all week. We've really put you to work, Jim. You've been to the law school, the International Institute, various classrooms, take part in courses and seminar series, and now you come to the best, to ISR. It's a great pleasure to have you here on this occasion. Christian Davenport will introduce Jim in a moment. This occasion celebrates the careers of Warren Miller and Phil Converse, two giants in the development of modern social science and in the development of this institution, ISR, here at Michigan. Every year we have a lecture in their honor to celebrate the work of path-breaking scholars who continue to be actively generating new knowledge. Warren and Phil sit as part of the center of the group of people who built ISR and behavioral social science more generally. They were institution builders. Warren with ICPSR and with our own center, CPS, and Phil with the broader ISR and the Center for Advanced Study at Stanford. They understood the value of public goods and institutions in research, in the creation of knowledge, in the training and teaching of students, in the kind of spillover effects that excellence in research has on other parts of campus, on the community, and on our country. Intellectually, their work has spawned many literatures in public attitudes, in elections, political parties, political psychology, ideology, accountability, governance, and representation. If you wanted to play a parlor game of what empirical research work today using quantitative measures of politically relevant behavior was not spawned by these two men, or at least the work of these two men, you'd be hard-pressed to win that parlor game unless you threw up your hands and said really close to almost everything we do involves the careful collection and analysis of behavioral data. They are the trunks of many branches of social science. So this occasion gives us the opportunity to honor them and give gratitude for their work and to recognize stellar contributions in their tradition. And as for today's topic, it's hard to imagine one more fitting. We've entered a twilight zone of sorts in the election year, and we need truly gifted scholars to help make sense of it and what has led up to it. So I'll let Christian introduce our speaker.
Thank you. Hear me? Good? Meta? Let's go. So the Miller-Converse lecture seeks to honor the best of us by bringing them in to share their work. And no better person for this than Jim, in my opinion, a dear friend, former colleague, and someone I consider both a mentor and a slightly younger brother. By any stretch of the imagination, Jim has an impressive publication record as of today because it literally changes every couple of days. He's got 8 books, 167 articles and book chapters, but none of this fluff, right? There's like 44 pieces in the top 3 journals, which I think places him on some other listing of incredibly prolific individuals. And this doesn't even count the 45 grants that he's got, most of them which come from the National Science Foundation, which for those of us that have gotten one, you realize exactly how astounding that feat is. Much will be said and should be said about Jim's overall amount as well as quality of work, There's a range of topics, the court, self-censorship, the police, abortion rights, inequality, intolerance, political parties, racial recognition, racial reconciliation, PTSD, justice, repression, and perhaps the most continuous stream, political legitimacy, actually, going back to 1977. Jim has always taken on timely as well as tough topics as they arose in the world: Nazis and intolerance in America, anti-Semitism and democratic values in Russia, reconciliation in apartheid South Africa, trauma in the wake of political violence in Cambodia, and most relevant for the current conversation, Trump in America. Throughout all of this, there is a consistency to Jim's work. There is an immense importance to social science. For example, who feels or does not feel free? Who is willing to allow or not allow someone to live near them or have some positive association or connection? Which political institutions are perceived as being or not being fair or legitimate? Who is or who is not worthy of forgiveness? This is Jim's core interest. First and foremost, in my mind, Jim is a scholar of political order and how nation, state, and society do or do not stay together. How he characterizes himself might be very different from how I see him, of course, but this is what I've always found to be essential for Jim's work. There's a thoroughness to Jim's work which is consistently brought to the best and the most interesting ideas within social science, broadly conceived to the problem that he's confronting at the time. Even some of the more classic work that is often forgotten by contemporaries, Jim finds new ways to kind of bring them back and to remind us that these people were onto something back in the day. There is an incredible thoroughness with which he considers conceptualization, measurement, method of analysis. I was always astounded by Jim's ability to step outside of what I deem to be the most kind of popular methods within public opinion, because I'm just like, yeah, that's what Jim does principally. But I remember being in environments repeatedly where Jim was like chiming in about different things, and I'm just like, how do you know about neural networks? Or what's he talking about time series stuff? And so the voluminous conception he had of our enterprise, I always was impressed by. And the writing is simply described as eloquent, which frankly, I think for most social sciences is a major step, right? And so I was always taken with that. There's a certain boldness to Jim's work, as well as oddly humility actually, in participation of the scientific enterprise. And this is where I'll end on this point of humility and humanity. He hired me for my first job, so I'm connected to him in a particular way that most would not necessarily reflect well on in many respects, but it's endured incredibly well over time. He literally and figuratively opened up his office, his house, his mind and his heart to me as a young person struggling to find his place in political science and the world in general. And he never sugarcoated stuff. I'm just like, just because he was all open didn't mean he liked everything that you did. And in fact, he would tell you very clearly, I thought that part of your piece was pretty weak, or I'd let that part of your research agenda go. And that is something that is incredibly important to get, right? So many a time he did not care for what I had to say and would tell me so, and that was priceless. I was actually in preparation for this going back to certain things. I occasionally got in trouble in the discipline with different things, and Jim was one of those people to kind of like set you correct, and those people I think you hold in very high esteem when you acknowledge that most of the time we're not given such advice or ignored if you get in trouble, but he did not. But this was always done in a manner that you thought was caring and respectful, and he was always open to hearing and seeing the next version, and yet the next version and the next version of the thing that you were working on. This is not just for me, but this was for everyone that he came across. And it was funny because I showed this Jim before. So this is 1995. I left the University of Houston and went to the University of Colorado. So I was, exactly. So this is typical Jim, right? So this is a conference on state repression, another topic that Jim works on, but wouldn't necessarily see himself as being working on exclusively. He's schooling the rest of us on some theoretical point on political order or some methods thing that we got wrong, and we were riveted. Will Morris to his left, Edward Ziegenhagen, Steve Poe, Karen Rasler, Shannon Blanton, and Jim was systematically going through everybody's paper and revealing the strengths and the weaknesses to make all of them better. Now, also typical Jim, the invite came to be, would you like to be in the edited volume? And Jim was like, no. Why? Because it was one of those 44 pieces in AJPS or JOP, right? But you took no offense to it. And what was fascinating was as the volume moved forward, we were all reflecting on the comments that Jim made in this particular space to advance and improve that work. And that was very much the kind of quintessential aspect of what Jim produced and what he represented as a scholar and what he represented as a colleague and dear friend. So let's bring him up here, and here we got to go for today. Jim, have some fun. Looking forward to it. What do I press to get back to the talk? What do I press to get back to the talk? Where's our guy? Oh, there we go.
All set? Thank you, brother. Hard to follow that, isn't it? I'd like to begin today by expressing my sincere gratitude to Ken Coleman and to the families of Warren Miller and Phil Converse for the opportunity to come and talk to you today. Christian has been a wonderful host this week, but I've also enjoyed Nick Valentino all week long and his brilliant insights on all sorts of issues. So it really has been one of the most special weeks of my life. University of Michigan is hallowed ground for a political scientist. And there's no question that Warren and Phil were among the founding fathers of the discipline that I love so much. So I'm really honored and pleased to be here. Now, I'd also like to thank my good friend Joe Sutherland from the director of the Artificial Intelligence Center at Emory, who responded to my invitation, was able to come today. Now, I made a lot of good friends this week, and therefore I thought I would start my talk with an admission. It can't leave this room, however. You've got to promise about that. Not today, but I've been referred to by my title at Stellenbosch. I'm an extraordinary professor. Now, in about 40 minutes' time, you'll have the evidence to rebut that claim. But in fact, my title at Stellenbosch is extraordinary professor. Now, since I'm among friends, I'll tell you all the truth. The title is pronounced the British way. So it's not extraordinary, it's extraordinary. That means I'm not ordinary. And what am I not ordinary about? I don't teach and they don't pay. So it's a pretty good deal. However, if they ever tried to revoke the title, I would pay to get it back. So it's kind of a strange relationship. I'm also the Sidney W. Sowers Professor at Washington University in St. Louis. Now, do any of y'all know who Sowers is? I'll give you a hint, Admiral Sowers. I'll give you a hint, Harry Truman, and I'll give you a hint, the CIA. So my chair was endowed by the person who created the CIA. So now that I've got all my dirty laundry on the table, I'd like to turn to talking about Trump and the presidential election of 2020. This is a talk on a book that's forthcoming with Russell Sage. It'll be out in May of this year. And it's a study of whether Trump did damage to democracy in the US over the course of the election and the insurrection in 2020 and 2021. The project was really inspired by people who are concerned about the rise of populism around the world. Here's a nice quote from Larry Diamond, a distinguished political scientist at Stanford, that says, "Populism presents some dilemmas for democracy, and this is one. Sometimes democracies grow stale and occluded and need reform, but if populist reform sentiment runs amok, it can so damage the existing institutions that it destabilizes democracy itself. Now, I took that as a challenge and tried to turn it into a hypothesis in an empirical study that could test whether the actions of Trump and his fellow travelers actually did damage to American political institutions, to American democracy by weakening our political institutions. I thought about this because I've been studying institutions for a very long period of time, and it seemed to me that this was a great challenge for institutional theories, and especially theories about what makes institutions work and be effective in a democratic political system. So obviously institutions need resources, no question about that. They need the approval of their constituents. People need to be happy with their performance, but and that's sometimes known as specific support, but they also need something called legitimacy. Indeed, legitimacy might be the most important political capital that institutions can enjoy. I'll explain legitimacy theory to you real briefly. There are different kinds. I don't know if there are any theorists in here, but one kind is normative legitimacy, which relies on developing expectations of institutions and seeing whether they're met. That's not me. Instead, I focus on sociological legitimacy, which is the mass public's perceptions and evaluations of their institutions. This is sometimes known as institutional loyalty, and I think loyalty is a very good way to think about it. In terms of the larger theory, it's diffuse support, but really I like the phrase, it's a reservoir of goodwill. And what that means is that people will stand by the institution even when it's performing poorly. So I often say legitimacy is for losers. And what I mean by that is that people who win don't usually challenge what an institution is doing. People who lose do. And then they ask, does this institution have the right to make the decision? Am I obliged to accept the decision? Must I follow the decision? That is the problem of legitimacy. Institutions that have legitimacy can rely on voluntary compliance, can rely on people complying because they think it's what they ought to do rather than what they're paid to do or what they're punished if they don't do. The classical power of the purse and power of the sword from our founding father, Lin-Manuel Miranda. Now, there's been an explosion of interest in legitimacy in all parts of the social sciences. You would just be amazed at how many different scholars are looking at legitimacy on political institutions, economic institutions, central banks, police, law enforcement. There are even studies of the legitimacy of algorithms. It's just a theory that has been stretched all over the map, and that's not even counting the normative theorists who actually have rediscovered the concept as well. Now, perhaps you're wondering for a moment why this legitimacy stuff is so important, and I'll show you why. These slides represent unhappy losers before the Pakistani Supreme Court, the Afghanistan Supreme Court, Nigerian High Court, and the burning to the ground of the Colombian Supreme Court. These are institutions that did not have sufficient legitimacy to get the arsonist to accept their decisions. So legitimacy really is a powerful, powerful form of political capital. That leads me to our favorite populist, President Trump. And as you know, President Trump has questioned many parts of a the American democratic setup, from the deep state to federal court judges and so on. But of course, the major attack was on the election of 2020. And then no one can forget this, the assault on the Capitol on January 6, 2001. The election and the insurrection are really only two parts of the story, though. Trump has been accused of refusal to comply with courts. Not everyone agrees, but many contest the Barrett nomination and confirmation under the circumstances. And most people can fill in the blank of something that they believe Trump did to undermine American institutions. Here's just one quote from after the election. Trump said, "The US Supreme Court has been totally incompetent and weak on the massive election fraud that took place in the 2020 presidential election. We have absolutely no proof. We have absolute proof, but they don't want to see it." Sorry, that's what you call motivated reasoning. We have absolute proof, but they don't want to see it. No standing, they say. So this is just one of the many ways in which Trump tried to undermine American political institutions. So all of my career, I've been influenced by reality. And what I mean by that is I've often looked at the world and observed something and decided that it would be an interesting test of a political science theory. My first book was on the efforts of Nazis to march in Skokie, Illinois, many, many years ago. But I saw Trump's attack on democracy as an opportunity for a new firehouse study. Now, I'm not denigrating the ANES one single bit, but they know years in advance when the election's going to be held. Now, they may not know who lives through the primaries to get to the end, but they can plan well in advance, and that's very different to a firehouse study like a volcanologist who's responding to the explosion of a volcano. So it's different because the world is changing very, very quickly. It's difficult because you're trying to write questionnaires quickly, but more importantly, find money quickly, very quickly. And so I was able to put together 4 different surveys over the course of this period, beginning in July of 2020. These are all national surveys, all done by Nora Kamara-Speak. A survey in July 2020, a post-election in December, a post-insurrection in February that included a very large African-American sample, and then a re-interview of the African Americans in June of 2021. Let me restate the hypothesis. Attacks on institutions by Trump and his friends undermine the legitimacy of American political institutions. And while I've almost always focused on the Supreme Court in this work, I extended the legitimacy theory here to the US Senate, in part because of its role in confirming judges, and to the presidency as an office as well. Now, there's been a lot of speculation about the demise of American democracy. One author said, this is a time when professional doom-mongering about democracy has become one of the most important, most inflationary sections of the American economy. And that really is true. You can turn to any journal virtually anywhere and point to speculation that Trump has hurt democracy. So my job in my book is to bring evidence to bear on that speculation. Let me give you my conclusions first and my evidence second. Try as they might, I conclude that Trump and the MAGAites were unable to inflict any significant damage on the legitimacy of American institutions. I bet you a nickel most of y'all didn't want to hear that conclusion. To the question of the title of my book, Democracy's Destruction, I argue on the basis of data, perhaps not. Instead, here's my understanding of what happened. Before the election of 2020, many people had already become alienated from American political institutions. So in effect, there was almost a ceiling beyond which it was difficult to go. Then we have the issue of motivated reasoning, and that is people perceiving reality in a way that supports and reinforces their pre-existing views, making it very difficult. As you know, it's very difficult for public opinion to change on anything. Trump is not regarded as a credible source, even by some of his allies. And therefore, without credibility, he's unable to persuade as effectively as he would otherwise be. The book by Calmo and Mason actually makes this point very strongly as well. And then there was backlash. Now, there's a new book arguing that backlash doesn't happen very often, and I actually agree with that. But a pro-democracy backlash seemed to mobilize in response to Trump's threat, and that became a significant force in my surveys. Moreover, while some people think of democratic values as nothing more than platitudes, in fact, they anchor attitudes toward institutions, making them very resistant to change. And then legitimacy itself as a form of loyalty is resistant to change. You know that. I bet many of y'all are going to be loyal to your football team next year, even when it goes 6-6 over the course of the whole season. 7-6. That would be a winning season. I like the 6-6. So the conclusion I draw here is, and I'm beating a dead horse, I guess, but the conclusion is that institutions are resilient. That's what makes them institutions. Legitimacy provides the political capital that makes institutions withstand threats to their integrity. Just as a footnote, I will give to you the example of Biden's effort to manipulate the Supreme Court. You might recall that, but you might not, because it went exactly nowhere. A group of about 30 lawyers were impaneled, and I gave them all of my evidence. And I said, y'all are crazy if you're going to be attacking this institution because it has way too much support. And then I said, remember 1937 and FDR. And in fact, that movement went just about nowhere, had no success. Now, I'm after sociological legitimacy, so let me give you an example of the indicators. These are surveys, questions put to the American people in the surveys. If the Supreme Court started making a lot of decisions that most people disagree with, it might be better to do away with the court altogether. You can see from the post-insurrection survey that the court had a great deal of legitimacy, 61% given legitimacy affirming answers, but only 14% denying the court legitimacy. This is a 6-item scale. It's got great psychometric properties, but I just wanted to give you exemplars from each of the measures. I've been working on Supreme Court legitimacy all my life. My foray into presidential maybe didn't work exactly as well as I hoped it would. But one of the items I used is, all things considered, the American people have an obligation to accept Joe Biden as the legitimate leader of the country. And here, 3/4 of the people extended legitimacy. For the US Senate, I relied on old work by Jerry Lowenberg and G.R. Boynton in Germany on the Bundestag. And I asked the US Senate ought to be changed so that for each state, the number of senators and representatives in the US Congress is the same, 435 for each. And you can see there kind of a middling level of legitimacy. So let's get to the data. What I have here is results from 3 of the surveys on US Supreme Court legitimacy. And this is an index, and this is the number of pro-legitimacy responses given to the 6-item scale over the course of the 3 surveys. And I've indicated here the point where the election took place and the point where the insurrection took place. I think one would be very hard-pressed to conclude that legitimacy was lost. I think the real statistical answer is there's not a hell of a lot of difference across the 3 surveys, but certainly there's no evidence of decline across the 3. Same is true of the Senate. I do not have pre-election measures of the Senate or the presidency, but again, from before the insurrection to after the insurrection, no evidence of decline. And for the presidency, no evidence of decline. So the conclusions I draw, the minimalist conclusion on all 3 institutions, is no evidence of decline, perhaps some limited evidence of increase, but irrefutable evidence that Trump failed to inflict damage on the institutions. Now, the question that must be addressed next is the question of heterogeneity. And by that I mean, did it matter how people perceived the election and whether they assessed Trump's claims that the election was rigged? Does it matter for the legitimacy that they extend to him? And the answer is not really. So what this is a 4-category measure of whether the person was very certain or highly uncertain that the election was rigged. And this is the mean legitimacy score across those 4 categories. I think you can see that there's just not much of a relationship there. The correlation is 0.06, practically nothing. So what I conclude from that is whether people bought Trump's claims or not didn't connect to the legitimacy that they're willing to extend to the Supreme Court. The next hypothesis has to do with whether legitimacy declined among those approving of the Capitol rioting. Same sort of hypothesis, same sort of answer. On one side of the graph is those who viewed the rioting as harmful, on the other is not harmful, a correlation of 0.08, and really not much of a relationship at all across those. Now, I'm trying to simplify some of the analysis. All of this is borne out by a whole bunch of assessments, not just the riots and not just the election, but 6 or 7 different assessments measured by first awareness and then evaluations. Really, practically nothing was connected to legitimacy in either bivariate or multivariate results. Now, some of y'all should be thinking, probably are thinking, well, if it's not events that shape people's views, what does? If you're not thinking that, you should be thinking that, in my view. And the answer is democratic values. And what do I mean by democratic values? I distinguish between support for democratic institutions and democratic values themselves. So the values are support for the rule of law, and boy, that is a dynamite scale, prioritizing individual liberty over social order, political tolerance, and open-mindedness. And so support for American institutions is grounded in these relatively stable and powerful values, making legitimacy resistant to information from the election and from the insurrection. Just to give you a little bit of the evidence, and I know this is a somewhat biased test, but I'll do it anyway. This is the amount of variance that can be explained by different classes of factors. And you can see that the democratic values can explain 29%. An additional 4% goes to perceptions and evaluations of events, practically nothing to party assessments of party threats to democracy, and then something surprisingly high something to the remaining demographic variables. So I conclude from this that values matter the most, events not very much. So let me draw some conclusions here. First, you know, there are a million pundits out there who are drawing conclusions, and let me just say somewhat less than a million databases upon which to make conclusions. I think we need rigorous evidence when we try to draw those, and I'm sure you agree. Firehouse studies are necessary, but they're untidy, they're expensive, they're difficult to pull off, and they raise all kinds of issues of causality. But I contend that events are almost never exogenous. And what I mean by that is the power of events depends upon the level of exposure of individuals, their assessments of those events, and the degree of homogeneity in both assessments and awareness. And as a consequence, we have to measure those things if we're going to try to draw conclusions about them. I also draw some conclusions about the 2020 election. Institutions are resilient. Sources have to be credible to be persuasive. And generally attitudes are difficult to change. So therefore, it's not entirely surprising that I have the conclusions that I do. Now, I've got to be careful, and I am careful. Here we go. I do try to draw some conclusions of the future, about the future, but the most important caveat or a limitation of my work is in answering the question of whether Trump damaged democratic institutions. My answer is not yet. My data end in essentially the first half of 2021. So I'm extremely loath to draw conclusions beyond anything after the first half of 2021. I'll submit to you something that's controversial maybe, but Trump and his followers are not stupid. They can learn, and perhaps they're even going to learn from my book. And what they're going to learn is that institutions can suffer a great deal of abuse without being badly damaged. I think this is very different to Russia and Ukraine. Russia is going to take over a Ukraine that's practically destroyed. The Republicans don't want to do that. They want these institutions to remain intact. So the past is not necessarily prologue, and really this is almost something like a Heisenberg uncertainty principle in the sense that once we measure something and conclude about it, it actually changes the nature of reality. My book is not really about the Heisenberg principle. But many of these conclusions are unexpected, and I bet many scholars would prefer to believe that Trump did indeed do the damage. And in fact, I expected to find that Trump did the damage. And moreover, my publisher is very disappointed because a Sky is Falling book is a lot better seller than Everything is Okay book. So, you know, I tried hard not to believe my own results, to tell you the truth. In the end, I had to. But there are some caveats that I want to point to before I conclude. It seems like my findings run contrary to many, many other scholars. In fact, that may not be true. There's a great piece published in Perspectives in which Amal Ahmed argued the question of whether the American public is truly turning away from democracy could not be more pressing. Of course, I agree with that. The explosion of research on this question, however, has yielded no clear answers, as various studies have produced mixed and contrary findings. Boy, that's really true. And he goes on to discuss the findings of the Yale group that have been so persuasive and really taking those findings apart. Without a doubt, my findings refer to only a single aspect of democracy's demise, and that is the legitimacy of these institutions. But Ahmed is also persuasive on this point. He says the problem here is not that these studies are measuring different things, but they all purport to be measuring the same thing, which can lead to misleading interpretations, exaggerating the threat in some areas and downplaying it in the other. I have tried very hard not to make that mistake. I've tried very hard to limit my conclusions to institutions only. Democracies can be damaged in many, many different ways. Obviously, distrust, polarization. The real big question for the coming election is subnational institutions. That's where 2024 is going to be decided. Democracy can be undermined by artificial intelligence. Sorry, Joe. But it can also be undermined by artificial stupidity. And there seems to be a lot more of that around than there is of the former. So I only draw conclusions very, very clearly about institutions, nothing more and nothing less. Now, if any of y'all were at the Tuesday talk, you know that my conclusions refer to the population as a whole, but they decidedly do not refer to African Americans. Just about everything I've said to you is different for the African American sample. There's been a dramatic decline over the course of these surveys in support for institutions among African Americans. And in fact, chapters 6, 7, and 8 of my book deal specifically with that. But as a final thought, I'm attracted to this idea of a backlash, in part because of a paper we wrote many, many years ago on support for democracy in the EU. Perhaps it's true that democracies from time to time need some threats in order to mobilize citizens to fully appreciate the value of democracy as a form of self-government. I won't draw the next conclusion that comes from this, which would be a thank you, President Trump. But I do believe that backlashes are very important, and maybe that's what's happening in this country. Pro-democratic forces can be mobilized. I'm not willing to stand very much behind this, but it's conceivable that this period is characterized by 2 steps back, but 3 steps forward. I love Joni Mitchell, so I'll close with the quote from her famous song, "Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what it's got till it's gone? They paved paradise and they put up a parking lot." So I contend that American is not paradise. Of course, I contend that, but I don't believe we're yet ready to be paved over by a parking lot. Thank you for your attention. Welcome comments. All the way in the back.
Jim, my problem with the analysis is that you were mixing the institutions with the legitimacy of institutions. The reason that I believe that the institutions are in trouble is not because they lack legitimacy, is because they can be taken the way that a prova generale was January the 6th, where a series of honest Republicans refused to comply. Had, for example, the vice president signed what Trump was asking, then the outcomes would have been very different, regardless of the legitimacy, which at the time was high and continues to be high. Now, if he appoints, as the New York Times say, instead of 4,000 people, he appoints 40, then, and he selects them, not take the Republican establishment, but take his own people, assuming that he gets elected, then the situation is going to be very, very different. And that's what I told you that I am anxious about, and the analysis didn't help.
I have to agree to some degree, but think about this. The Washington Post has compiled all the litigation that was focused on the election for 3 months or so after the election. And I may get the figures slightly wrong, but not much wrong. And I believe there were about 80 lawsuits. And Trump lost 79.5. And Republican judges were about, I think, 40% of the judges who made those decisions. Now, you know, I don't wear rose-colored glasses. I wear blue glasses instead. But I do believe that one theory of what happened in 2020-21 was that American democracy was tested very, very seriously, maybe more so than ever in recent history, and the institutions held up. The institutions were not captured as they are in my South Africa. They were not captured. They were effective. People were prosecuted. They are going to jail and so on. Now, I'm not saying that that'll be true in the future, in part because we now know where the soft underbelly of democracy is. It's not the Supreme Court. It's the Secretary of State of the state of Michigan or whatever. It's lower level figures who are going to control the election. So my reading is that Trump's goal from the day he became president was to eviscerate the institutions so they could be controlled, and that he failed to do that. And the institutions largely stood up for democracy. I appreciate completely that we can disagree on this point. Don?
Oh, I'm sorry. I have a bushel full of questions, but I'm only going to ask one. I'm sure that disappoints most of you here.
Can the
it's really
volume go up?
A comment more than a question, and I want you to react to it. It seems to me, if you're interested in legitimacy from the point of view of the mass public, which is one way to look at it, quite different than in your answer to the prior question about what courts were doing. But if we take your point of view seriously, that legitimacy arises from the mass public, and you're interested in the effect of the insurrection, then it seems to me you missed your target in what you were expecting to find, or what was at risk. What was at risk was the democratic institution of the orderly transfer of power. It was elections that were at stake. And there's nothing in your evidence, I believe, that speaks to that. Is that right? And if that's right, then why is that?
Well, first, of course, there was the transfer of power. We were saved by a Pence shoestring for sure, but we also don't know the counterfactual. We don't know what would have happened had Pence cratered on January 6th. And I think there is a reasonable theory that says that Trump would have been rebuffed by all kinds of institutions. Who knows, of course. But the transfer of power did take place. And I think it took place because these institutions were powerful enough to stand up to the threats. Maybe only just powerful enough. Yes. Oh, I don't think so. It's, you know, I've written extensively on the election of 2000, right? Bush versus Gore. And that election, now there's a little bit of a caveat, of course, but the reason why that election ended is the Supreme Court ruled, and it had enough legitimacy that the people, even the people who disagreed with the ruling, the losers, accepted it and went on about their business. And I think that's something of the story of the election of 2020. Obviously, I'd like to know about the legitimacy. Well, I'm not positive I would. I don't know what it means to talk about the legitimacy of a process rather than an institution. The Senate met. I'm sorry? Well, the orderly transfer of power, and I'm not an expert on this, is in the Senate and the House. Is that not true? But it's in the Senate and the House. That's who makes the decision, not the Capitol grounds. And that, in fact, is it the Senate or the House? I think it is the Senate. Am I wrong? The combination. Thank you. And that happened. Fair enough. Fair enough. I live in South Africa, so orderly is a bonus. Anything that's good that happens is good enough. It doesn't have to be orderly.
Thanks. So I think I've seen other data in Europe and stuff. It kind of makes sense also the erosion of the rise of the far right, what effects it's having. So I totally buy it. So I want push you on one thing and then want your opinion on another. The first thing is your model of what is an equilibrium with high legitimacy and how it erodes. And what does that mean in terms of measurement strategy? Because if we think of this as an equilibrium outcome, and that actually the way it erodes is not slowly, but through these tipping point models, should we be measuring average support? Yeah. Should we be measuring attitudes or preference intensity? Like, to what extent there's an asymmetry and who's willing to kind of push against a change in the status quo or not? So that's my first question. And my second question is more, there's another institution that I don't know how to think about, so I just want to know how you do, which is the one that Schachtschneider talks about, which is the party system. Democracy is not functional, whatever the quote is, lest parties. And so I come from a country, France, where the party system has unraveled. And I don't know how to think about this. And I do think, living in the US, I do think there's a way in which the Republican Party, all the incentives is for them to lie, to take on the same discourse as Trump, and to coordinate in a way that I think it's not great for democratic institutions. So how do you think of the institution, the party system institution? What is this in your story?
I confess that I hate it when people do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. Your point about tipping points is a good one. And the other lectures that I've given this week focus on the impact of the Dobbs ruling on abortion. And so the whole story that I have today is institutions are stable and resilient. But that's not true with Dobbs. That's not true with Dobbs one single bit. We've never seen a change in legitimacy like we've seen with Dobbs, and moreover, it's persisted over time. And there's a lot of components to the story, but one is that it was a tipping point for many people that was a result of the Supreme Court moving radically to the right from 2020 onwards. Before 2020, the court was roughly a 45 liberal, 55 conservative court. It changed, people changed, they were on a tipping point, along came Dobbs, and the court was punished a great deal for it. So my argument about stability is not an argument of inevitability. It's only that really special circumstances can cause people to rethink their commitments to the institutions. But I didn't hear in completely your second point. The part I'm afraid I don't know very much about pardons. Let me see if I can. I'm afraid I don't have an answer to that. Sorry. Vince, you want to?
Yes.
So this is great, Jim. I'm sorry I missed your earlier talk. You made a reference to, I think, a talk on Tuesday about African Americans, and I wanted to see if you could expand on that for those who weren't present for that, particularly given that, and you'll tell me if I'm misunderstanding your point, I thought you argued that legitimacy was for losers, but since African Americans mostly oppose Trump, shouldn't they have behaved differently in light of that? Or am I misunderstanding you?
So I'm going to take that as two questions. What I meant by legitimacy is for losers is that it's only important in the political realm to know if those who lose are going to pick up arms and go to the hills, or whether they're going to stay committed to the rules of the game and fight anew. And that's what legitimacy does. If a decision is legitimate, people will accept it even though they disagree with it. And they accept it because they think it's procedurally fair, the institution has the authority to do it, various things like that. Now, I can put my argument on African Americans in a nutshell. So African Americans are relatively low in democratic values compared to others, and therefore those relatively stable values don't provide much protection from incoming events that are disruptive. Point number one. Point number two, the events were disruptive. They were understood in racialized terms, from the Confederate flag at the insurrection to, you name it, the challenging of black votes in Atlanta, and on and on and on. So threat levels were raised very, very high. Now, there are two kinds of experiences that are important in influencing people's attitudes towards institutions. I'm trying to be brief. One is personal experiences, and about 45% of African Americans have had the experience of being stopped unfairly by the police in the last 5 years, or whatever my question says, and all surveys showed the same. But the other is vicarious, okay? And that is the belief that one's group is treated unfairly. The correlation between direct and vicarious, approximately 0. Now, here's what happened. My earlier book was named Black and Blue, and it was based on a survey of African Americans in 2014. Shockingly low in-group attachments in 2014. Dramatically higher in-group attachments in 2021. Easy answer, Black Lives Matter, right? So the dramatic dramatic increase in in-group attachments activated, empowered vicarious experiences, leading to two powerful forces contributing to the alienation from institutions. One is your own experience. You don't have to be a member of a group to know you've been screwed. But the other is vicarious, and it got supercharged by the dramatic change in identities. And those two factors added together with the perceived threat, especially of the insurrection, not of the election, but of the insurrection. And literally African Americans fell off the cliff in terms of their support. Now, just one tiny little footnote to that, it took a while. It took a while, and that's an important part of yesterday's talk, and that is that events don't have their effect in very short periods of time. They have to trickle down. They have to be interpreted. They have to, preachers have to learn how to preach about them. And that takes months. And so those who look at events right after they occur and say, well, they didn't have much impact, or they did have impact, or whatever, those conclusions would change if they track the effect of those events over time. Now that makes for methodological problems, period. I'm going too far. But I'm telling you, Vince, that chapters 6, 7, and 8, 6 and 7 are on democratic values, and 8 is on support for political violence. They are very different stories to what I've been telling y'all today. Yes.
I want to build off something Charlotte mentioned about the effects of, this idea that we don't need 50% of the population not having faith in democratic institutions. We might only have 20%. So this heterogeneous effects that you mentioned. But even those people, say in the surveys, who do believe that violence is legitimate now, those people, I could imagine, would still profess legitimacy of our democratic institutions because they perceive themselves as restoring them, and they see the left as the side that is, is doing the damage. Because populists in this scenario aren't revolutionaries; they see themselves as reestablishing the tradition, right? So, how do we know that? I guess that's what in this kind of like survey research, how do we know that that's really capturing a commitment to democratic process, as opposed to just say trust in institutions that they see as being depraved because the wrong people are in control of those institutions?
I don't have a great answer to that, but I would rather imagine that the 20%, if I said to them, if the Supreme Court started making a lot of decisions that most people disagree with, we ought to do away with it. I bet that 20% would say yes. Or if I said to them, despite everything that's gone on, I'm paraphrasing, despite everything that's going on, Biden is a legitimate president of the United States, I think they would say no. So what I'm trying to argue is that by my measures of legitimacy, those people would score, I believe, as alienated from the institution and unwilling to extend support to them. So in that sense, I think I believe my results, and I believe that they would mobilize for violence and so on. But let me answer a second part of your question. In the end of the book, the whole last chapter is trying to rebut anticipated criticisms. And I'm not going to tell you all about all the criticisms because you've only hit 3 out of the 9 so far, and I'm going to keep my mouth shut on the rest. But one of the criticisms is, what the hell does democracy have to do with a bunch of people sitting in their computer typing in 1 for agree strongly, 2 for disagree strongly, and so on? And I think that's a little bit of your question. After all, the insurrectionists were not a random sample of American people. They're probably not even in the A and the S, is my guess. And so my argument in retort to that is that what people, ordinary people, accept from their leaders constrains the behavior of the leaders. Of course, ordinary people don't start the revolution. But if they don't join in the revolution in one way or another, the revolution tends to fail. Am I right about that, Christian? Maybe I'm not, but that's my argument nonetheless. And so a lot of people will say, well, these answers to the questionnaires, they don't matter. But I believe that the willingness to support revolutionary or anti-democratic efforts is fundamental. I'm a political culture guy. Our team was the second one into the Soviet Union, doing surveys of public opinion for a decade in the Soviet Union. And that's the story of the Soviet Union. It changed not because of Gorbachev, it changed because of the cultural values of the people, demanded voice, demanded accountability, demanded not liberal democracy, illiberal democracy, demanded majoritarianism, and that forced the leaders to change. So At the end of the day, I'm going to argue that the mass public obviously drives nothing, but it has a big impact on the way things turn out from elite gambits. Yes, Walter?
So I have many things to say, but I won't say them. So what you just said kind of sparks in my mind, there's a gap in the structure of the argument that you have laid out. And the argument you just made ties into the lacuna of not focusing on the parties.
Not focusing on
Not focusing on the political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, especially the Republicans. And so what we've seen in the past while, I'll say how long that while is in a second, is the Republican Party is not what it was. And so now it's basically a bank account for the incoming autocrat, but it's not. All these officials have changed their views, at least what they're willing to say. So in terms of building the momentum that you just described is important for the success of the revolution, is the word you use. That's what's happening right now. And so by not looking at the parties in any way, I think you kind of miss that structurally in your argument that you have laid out with your evidence. And this leads to the timing of this. So you have a view of the 2000 election, and I have a different view of that election, to say the very least. And so if you're looking for someone who thinks the court is delegitimated by its decision in the 2000 Bush v. Gore case, I'm one. And so that is the beginning, that's the continuation of a downfall through the electoral process of that part of democracy. And the key thing to say, to be brief, is people win elections by getting minorities, not majorities, not even pluralities. And so if you have a minority that's less than the other party in terms of votes, that's the key to the current dominant group maintaining their control, looking at demographics, to be really terse, but I think you get what I'm talking about. So that's been a theme through the Republican Party for a long time, at least since 2000, arguably earlier. And in terms of delegitimating the court, Roe v. Wade was a big source of delegitimacy in many people's views from the non-Dobbs side. So that's been continuing again. I don't know when it starts again, but it's not 2000, it's earlier. And so you have this building thing. So it's the structure of your argument is kind of like there was a shock in 2000 and you should expect to see effects around that discontinuity. But it's been this building thing with many tendrils and tentacles. There's the Tea Party and the overthrow of like the Bushes, who talks about them and the Republicans. Even Mitch McConnell now has gone over to the other side. So it's building and building. So I think that your argument you just made in response to the question, building, is not really compatible with the rest of the argument of seeing the discontinuity focused on those three institutions that you named there. So that's, I wonder if you have a response to that.
So I'm a little bit confused because when you talk about political parties, I assume you're talking about other institutions. You're not talking about partisanship. Is that true?
Political parties, right. Elected officials and
Elites.
and primaries which connect voters.
And I think you're saying that the outcome of the struggle depends upon the actions of elites, among other things. And boy, I couldn't agree more with that. But I think the success of the elites is dependent upon being able to mobilize support.
Well, what happened now in Republicans is the primaries became where the election is decided, and the gerrymandering technology was invented, and so now they no longer have to compete with the general public to get elected, and that's meaning the public is driving them, except that's tiny fraction in these gerrymandered districts.
I don't disagree with that either. But so not being able to answer very well the question that you've asked, let me change it in a way that I can answer it a little bit better on my terms. And it's a somewhat interesting switch in time. So a lot of this work, my work, this book, has been criticized for ignoring the role of partisanship. That's how I'm going to get started in part. And here's the short answer. I didn't ignore partisanship one single bit. It's not much part of it. It's not a very much part of the story of the outcome. Here's the reason why. Partisanship is an extremely powerful predictor of how people assess the events of the election and of the insurrection. That's probably not a surprise to you, right? So the connection between partisanship and assessments is strong, but because there's no connection between assessments and legitimacy, there's therefore no connection between partisanship and legitimacy. There is some debate in the literature, but it seems, as I read it and as I contribute to it, the Supreme Court's support has not been, before Dobbs, has not been polarized the way attitudes toward other institutions in this country have been. So the story of legitimacy, the story of democracy, I'll grant you, may be a story of political parties, but the story of legitimacy is not the story of party ID and partisan attachments. And I would say that even if Warren Miller were here today. Yes.
So I'm thinking about these two lines of argument, right? The legitimacy doesn't really change in the wake of this stuff. And then we have Dobbs, where you find, and I also found in a piece that we did with Matt Lewandowski, you know, a bunch of radical change that occurs at that same point, right? And if we have this radical change occurring at particular points, it suggests, you know, basically an inflection point story. That what's going on is something's presumably happening behind the scenes that leads to radical changes in perceived legitimacy of institutions at particular moments. And so the story of the top line legitimacy of the moment, I take as saying these whatever it is that happens in the background hasn't added up yet to that particular phenomenon. Yeah. But I'm wondering if you what you think it is that's going on in the background and how that is or isn't adding up at the moment. That's really the underlying story here. Because if the story is just the top line, well, we know that can change quickly. If the story is something we can measure about the underbelly, that seems like the fascinating part.
Gotcha. So the overwhelming, do you want to jump in? The overwhelming story of legitimacy is stability. It's just amazing how stable it is. Obamacare ruling, even the voting rights rulings, just amazing how stable it is. It never changes. Let me be clear about that. It hasn't changed much in the last 25 years. I believe that Dobbs was sui generis. I believe that there is a combination of circumstances that made that a once-in-a-lifetime case. And the circumstances were not the leaking of the opinion, not that kind of stuff, but the circumstances were the radical move to the right of the court. That's one. The intense level of awareness of the decision. That's two, but connected to that is the sustainability of that awareness, because the Democrats, well, a lot of people wouldn't let the issue go. So Obamacare is decided and it's out of the public domain in a month. Abortion is not out of the public domain. It's kept alive because there's partisan advantage. It's kept alive because now it's an issue in the states. It's kept alive for a lot of reasons, and therefore it keeps on giving. And then the last component is that abortion is a moral issue. And I'm using this in the Linda Skitka kind of analysis. And what's distinctive about moral issues is that they can't be easily compromised. So you've got people standing on the, and I guess the last component is 2/3 of the American people oppose the decision. So you've got people standing on the precipice. A bad decision comes along. Usually nothing happens, but it does happen this time, and it happens because the decision is of great moral importance, and people were fed up in the first place, and therefore it was a tipping point for the court. Now, there is more to that story because legitimacy rebuilds itself. And I won't go into that because that'll get things more complicated.
It was the point of an inflection point. For me, back in the 90s, Newt Gingrich deemed the Democrats or the opposition as evil. So that opened up the gates of, in my mind, for, okay, they're the evil people. And then so we've got the evangelicals that could, you know, work on that, and the whole idea of evilness. And I hear that every time a politician, oh, they're evil, 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 evil. So it seems like they can just do and think whatever they want. Oh, that's one way to articulate it.
We know a little bit about this, and so we know that every day about 3 million kids in public schools are forced to say denominational prayers, despite the rulings by the Supreme Court. And the reason why they're able to do that is because social norms in these small communities preclude or punish anyone from complaining, and without litigation, without someone filing a complaint and hiring a lawyer, law is not self-enforcing. So I'm agreeing at some level that, you know, there are lots of parts of American society that do not extend legitimacy to the institutions and defy those institutions as often as they can. But these democratic values, and especially this rule of law measure, is extraordinarily powerful. Those of you who are presidential scholars have read Reed's Dowsey's great book. That's my scale that they're using, the rule of law scale. It predicts almost everything everywhere very strongly. And I believe that socialization, the fundamental values about law and tolerance and democracy at a fairly early age can be sustained, and therefore when institutions do bad things, the institutions are forgiven. There's loyalty. Now, what's the story of African Americans? Well, they're not taught that the Supreme Court is a great institution from ground zero, and therefore events come along and they don't have this buffer of democratic values to take away the reaction. That's not a very good answer to your question, but that's what I believe. Thank you.
All right, everyone. That was terrific. Let's give us a round of applause. I have a nice plaque and a gift for you on behalf of the Center for Political Studies, its faculty and its staff. And congratulations. This is an honor for all of us to listen to you talk. But the families of Warren and Phil have created this lecture and have created this honor. And it's just great to have you participate in this and give us these insights.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I appreciate the family.
There is a reception right outside with food and beverages. And so we hope that you can join us and continue the conversations in a smaller venue. Thank you very much.